You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. My guest today is Dr. Joseph Scales, a Marie Curie Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Religion, Philosophy and History at the University of Agder in Norway. As regular listeners will know, this podcast is the second part of a pair looking at the history and representation of conflict in ancient Judea. In part one, Joe gave us a whirlwind tour of a whole series of conflicts that shaped Jewish history from around 175 BCE through to the early 2nd century CE, looking particularly at their impact on Jewish nationhood and identity formation. That conversation provides really useful context for today's discussion in part two, which will dive deep into some of the textual sources for Jewish conflict history in antiquity. And Joe will be particularly drawing on his current research project called Fighting Talk, Motivating Violence in Ancient Judaism, which examines the nature of pre-battle speeches in ancient Jewish texts and their relationship to established forms of pre-battle exhortation in Greek and Roman sources. As Joe has written, people resort to violence for all kinds of reasons. In the interests of peace, it's essential to understand how people may be incited towards organised violence. In warfare, combatants are often incited towards their actions by others, and in the ancient world, such incitement frequently took the form of a pre-battle speech. Greek, Roman and Jewish literature contains many examples. So in unpicking a range of ancient pre-battle speeches and exploring recurring components such as the othering of enemies, claims about the just or necessary nature of upcoming violence, a commander's handling of his soldiers' fears and visualizations of success, Joe's research contributes not only to a deeper understanding of how warfare was conceptualized and driven in antiquity, but also to wider reflections on how organized violence can be conceptualized, justified and incited today. So it's really important work, and I'm very much looking forward to digging into it. Joe, thank you very much for being willing to chat across 2 episodes of the Visualising War and Peace podcast. I'm very much looking forward to finding out more about war, how war and battle were visualised and indeed justified for different audiences in antiquity, a topic tragically with huge ongoing relevance. And of course, in this episode and in last week's episode, we're talking about a part of the world which continues to be torn apart by brutal conflict. So before we get into our conversation today, I do want to take a moment to remember the thousands of people, including thousands of children, who've been killed in recent months in the latest war between Israel and Hamas. Our hearts go out to the victims on all sides, those killed and taken hostage by Hamas on the 7th of October, and those subsequently killed, injured and displaced by Israel's ongoing bombardment of Gaza. We at the Visualising War and Peace project continue to call for an urgent and immediate ceasefire and for the safe return of all remaining hostages as vital first steps in breaking this cycle of violence and working towards peace. Joe, as we've watched events unfold in Israel and Gaza over the last few weeks, we have seen, alongside terrible acts of physical violence, an ongoing war of words with politicians, campaigners, commentators drawing on different historical events and deploying often very loaded, sometimes very dehumanizing language to justify their own positions or their actions. And we might talk later about references to ancient history in contemporary efforts to get us to visualize the current conflict in particular ways. But for now, I want to head back into antiquity itself to look at how ancient commanders and authors used pre-battle speeches to get their audiences picturing upcoming violence, whether that was real or imagined, in different ways. So can you begin by telling us where we find evidence of these pre-battle speeches, which are the subject of your current research project? What kinds of texts have they been transmitted in, and how fabricated or real do they tend to be?
So there is a huge amount of research on this, particularly in and amongst classicists, as there's a long-standing tradition of reusing or referencing certain good speeches on the eve of battle, and particularly before assembled combatants. Essentially, it'd be helpful to first say that a pre-battle speech is necessarily given to an audience of combatants who are about to engage in some kind of collective violence. We can see echoes of the kind of language you might expect or see in pre-battle speeches in language that is fairly far removed from the context of warfare or battles or violence. And for my purposes, I'm kind of leaving these aside. But as you can imagine, there is a huge body of speech writing that deliberately draws from this kind of very tense, violent rhetoric, let's say. So in terms of the texts that they come from, you get a lot of precedents in Greek and Roman literature, and some scholars have explored how they function in these heroic sayings in Homeric literature and epic. You get biographies or histories. So the work of Thucydides is often credited as really influential in essentially establishing this as a motif. But you also have Julius Caesar writing in his own accounts of his own wars, some of his own. And then in our corpus that I'm kind of creating to explore this, particularly in ancient Jewish texts, we get texts that are known from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. We also have texts that are known from the so-called Apocrypha, so these Jewish Greek texts that remain in often in the middle of some people's Bibles, but they're integrated in Catholic Bibles. We get one from amongst the documents known from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then there are also some in the works of Josephus and Philo. So they span generally quite a diffuse range of genres, but typically, almost by their nature, they have to be embedded in a narrative. There has to be a battle that follows it or some kind of collected violence. And this is usually told in a narrative, and whether this is someone's personal experience or whether this is a construction of a future conflict, that really varies. So often it's about the placement of this more so than the kind of type of text it comes from, historical or biographical writing. In the kind of rundown of Jewish texts I've just gone through, some of them are presented as historically what was said, at least in that way, or I would say probably most of them are presented as something that was historically said. We have very good reason to question these, such as those recorded in the books of the Maccabees, and we should not accept them as reflexive of an actual speech given by the named person in texts like Philo's Life of Moses, who's making this up most of the time, or in the Book of Judith, who is a kind of pretty consciously created fictional figure. So this almost sidesteps a long-standing question amongst ancient historians and classicists and military historians about whether these speeches ever took place. Some of them definitely not, but I think there's definitely this opportunity to think about who were the literate elite in the ancient world, and quite often they overlap quite significantly with the military class. So a really straightforward example for my purposes is Josephus, who sees military campaigns essentially, and outside of the corpus, Julius Caesar, who reports his own reported speeches.
Okay, Joe, so thank you. You've given us a really good sense there of the range of texts and genres where we can find pre-battle speeches in ancient literature, particularly ancient Jewish texts. And you've raised the important question of how fictional, even supposedly factual or historical speeches can be in their narrated form. And that is a really important caveat for lots of reasons. But I suppose particularly as we consider what pre-battle speeches do to their wider readership, not just their internal audiences, they are a really, really interesting form of storytelling for us at the Visualising War project, because they very much get to the heart of our research on the world-building nature of narratives, the way in which the stories that we tell not only reflect how war gets pursued, but can actively shape it by shaping how people think and feel and behave. Pre-battle speeches, of course, are explicitly designed to influence what their primary audiences feel and think and do. But as you say, these texts also have much wider audiences. And as you've already outlined, they're shaped by all sorts of narrative traditions as well. So they have a really broad influence potentially on our habits of visualizing and pursuing war, and the ideas that they canonize, and the messages that they perpetuate. So with that in mind, I wonder, can you say a little bit more about how exactly these pre-battle speeches that you've been studying tend to pan out in the texts that survive from antiquity?
So we can really question, how did this work practically? Or they're often constructed in such a way that the outcomes of a battle are reflected in the speech already. So there's a lot of characterization going on. There's a lot of narrative work, but generally the idea that a commander might say at least some words of encouragement or give a battle plan to assemble troops or something like this, whether it was something everyone did is really questionable, but at least some of our sources who themselves experienced battlefields give the impression that it's an expected norm, and questions around the efficacy in the situation of an actual battlefield are almost slightly irrelevant if the people giving them think they're important. It doesn't really matter whether soldiers themselves got much out of it, so long as the general thought it was important to do. So another element of what I'll be kind of exploring is, can we think of them perhaps in the context of ritual studies as well, and consider how they enact something about conflict going forwards, about who we are, about who our enemies are. This kind of arrangement, I think, might be going on in them.
Yeah, well, pre-battle speeches were almost certainly delivered. The ones that survive to us have quite a tenuous relationship with that kind of history, but do help us think about different methods for visualizing battle before battle, and with the added complex layer of the fact that all of these texts are written with the benefits of hindsight, and so embed sometimes into those speeches an understanding of how the battle itself played out. And you've touched on some really interesting elements of these pre-battle speeches: identity formation, again, who we are, maybe what we're fighting for as well, justifications of war, identifying the enemy as well, sometimes othering the enemy too, which then might lead to the legitimization of certain kinds of violence, certain kinds of behavior, as well as allaying fears, perhaps engendering some encouragement, and visualizing perhaps future success. I'm fascinated by the idea that in some of these, that this may be a ritual rather than something that's meant to translate into a sort of real reaction on the ground amongst the soldiers. And we might come back to that. But I think it would be really helpful if we could drill down into some concrete examples. So there are loads of texts we can choose from, but you've talked to us already a little bit about First and Second Maccabees. So it might be good to start there with those two texts, obviously different kinds of texts themselves. Can you give us a flavor of some of the pre-battle speeches that we find in those texts, who delivers them, what kinds of points they tend to make, what impact they seem to have on audiences within the text, and also what role the speeches play in the texts as a whole?
Yeah, I think a good example might be to think about how one person is described in three ways as giving these kind of speeches, and some of them are parallels literally across First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, and the work of Josephus. So in his Jewish Antiquities, we have speeches from Judah Maccabee or Judas Maccabeus. This depends on the Latin or Greek for a Hebrew name. We get the first of these in First Maccabees 3. And essentially, there's a lot of elements here, but I'll read out what Judah says initially here. He says that it is easy for many to be hemmed in by a few, for in the sight of heaven there is no difference between saving by many or by few. It is not the size of the army that victory in battle depends, but strength comes from heaven. They come at us in great insolence and lawlessness to destroy us and our wives and our children and to despoil us. But we fight for our lives and our laws. He himself will crush them before us. As for you, do not be afraid of them. So this is early on in the kind of uprising. In First Maccabees, Matthias has already had some success, but he's just died essentially before this speech is given. And Judah takes on the role essentially of war leader. And at this point, they also seem to be unarmed, which is fascinating. There's another thing I've only really started to come on to is how often combatants seem to be distanced from their weapons in these speeches. So in the book of Joshua, the siege of Jericho, initially there's a lack of weapons. When Judith goes to assassinate Holofernes, she ends up using his own sword on the bedpost. She doesn't bring a weapon. And there's something going on here with weapons, so they pick up the weapons from the routing soldiers. So this is just a strange, odd, idle thought, but we see these elements here around victory dependent on heaven, and the kind of things that the enemies are about. Insolence, which generally is a motif around arrogance, setting oneself up in the place of God, lawlessness as well. And then a motif that doesn't actually seem to be quite common in lots of these speeches, at least in the corpus I've identified, but wives and children being at threat. I expected to find this more, but I haven't often seen this as a kind of a call to violence, a reason to fight. But then fighting for our lives, fighting for the law, and then this element of not being afraid, and not being afraid of them or taking courage is an incredibly sticky part of a pre-battle speech. It seems to crop up everywhere, and it is a very short kind of phrase. This phrase in the ancient Near East of fearing not is deployed in all kinds of different contexts, often with divine visitations and angels, we might think, but it seems to often be related to a real world experience of terror in battle. The importance of morale is tantamount, and an army that breaks loses all the time, often, particularly in at least many ancient historians' work, this idea of the cohesiveness of an army essentially decides the outcome in many ways. And then after the speech is given, they essentially have success. This help from heaven, which he alludes to, doesn't actually seem to really come into play that much. Judah is often credited. And then later on in the same chapter, Judith again tells them to arm themselves and be courageous, and then ready to fight early in the morning, these nations who have assembled against us to destroy us and our sanctuary. So again, it switches into this language of defense of the temple quite quickly. Now, jumping over to Second Maccabees, we're not given direct speech in Second Maccabees, at least in chapter 8. This is the first speech of Judas, but we're reported what he apparently said. Well, we do get some direct speech, but mostly it's told in indirect speech. So he says, he exhorted them not to be frightened by the enemy and not to fear the great multitude of the nations who are wickedly coming against them, but to fight nobly, keeping before their eyes the lawless outrage that the nations had committed against the holy place, read temple, and torture of the derided city, Jerusalem, as well as the overthrow of our ancestral way of life. It's interesting, but under this phrase, I'm not looking at the Greek at the moment, but it might be this concept of ancestral law as well. So our kind of practices. And then here's a quote: "For they trust to arms and acts of daring," he said, "but we trust in the Almighty God, who is able with a single nod to strike down those who are coming against us, and even if necessary, the whole world." And then he also goes on to reiterate this saying for all material we know from the Hebrew Bible. So in the time of Sennacherib, when so many Assyrians perish, and these other battles where these Jews fought alongside Macedonians, and essentially they're rescued. So in Second Maccabees, we've got a lot greater sense of divine intervention in this. Judas gives these speeches, but the battle outcome is portended by these apparitions in the sky, and violence is done by divine figures. In Second Maccabees, First Maccabees, they're particularly absent. And then when we jump to Josephus, again, we have a direct quote, and he writes, "No time will ever be given to you, my comrades, when there will be more need for courage and contempt of danger than at the present moment. For if you now fight bravely, you may recover that liberty which is loved for its own sake by all men. But to you, most of all happens to be desirable because it gives you the right to worship the deity." So Josephus is framing this in terms of rights, liberties, freedoms, and this probably is for a Roman audience who these concepts make a lot of sense. And then he goes on to say a few other things: "Exerting yourselves accordingly, bearing in mind death is the portion even of those who do not fight, holding firmly to the belief that if you die for such a precious causes as liberty, country, laws, and religion, you'll gain eternal glory." And then he has a few other things to say. But you get these shifts over time and in different texts from different perspectives in what it is these speakers are saying people should fight for. There's some contextual consistency because the setup for this is that the temple has been defiled, so it needs to be rededicated, and maybe there are some enemies that are going to destroy them, but we see the shifts over time and greater and lesser attention paid to the enemies in these particular ones. But what these each do is construct something that, at least for the reported speaker, they conceive as really, really important to their sense of identity. So it's not just questions of death. These three at least, are all very tied into the possibility that whoever's already resisting, they're going to die whether they fight or not, so they might as well resist. But they also are trying to encourage them to risk their lives and to kill for these very particular ideas that the audience may or may not be on board with. They may or may not think that these things are so important that this is what they do. But in these reports of such speeches, because all of them are immediately followed by the soldiers going out and fighting as one, there's no dissent in most of these. So they actively construct a sense of value for the audience, and they are telling them what is so important to go to these extreme lengths for. And maybe, let's say, in the historical time of the Antiochian persecution, the Maccabean revolt, this isn't exactly what's being threatened. But in the retelling and in the memory, these are the important things. This is what our enemies want to do. And especially by the time we get to Josephus' work, he already is responding to a tradition where, as I mentioned before, Gaius Caligula is also threatening the temple. Pompey, before him, reportedly enters the temple. The temple has been destroyed, like there are no end of threats to it. So reiterating that, it almost explaining this is why it was such a conflict to preserve the temple and why this happened, is doing something constructive about identity in a situation where, because it's often followed by success, it almost legitimizes what has been said beforehand.
Yeah, and as you say, there are some differences over time, and depending on who the textual audience, not the internal audience, might be. So Josephus writing things in ways that are going to resonate more with a Roman audience, obviously not a concern for First Maccabees or Second Maccabees, but then these continuities as well. And I'm really struck by the finding that you've had that actually women and children are referenced remarkably rarely, but the things that are frequently referenced are more abstract concepts of freedom, of nation, of laws, of rights, these things that very much matter to the nation and may matter a lot less to individual people, individual soldiers, as you say. But that's what comes across as being the justification, the exhortation in these speeches. So it's really, really interesting to get that picture. And you've mentioned then that what often happens in these texts is that we then see the soldiers, there's not much detail on their actual response to the speech, but the text implies the response is they go out and fight with cohesion, they go out and fight with success. So the impression is that these battle speeches work and that everyone's on board, and there's a lot of othering and them, the enemy, as lawless and so on. To what extent do these battle speeches then ever visualize a time beyond the fighting, as well as exhorting people to fight? Do any of them engage with ideas of that period beyond of conflict resolution or post-conflict transition? Or are they very much focused just on conjuring inspiring images that will drive the fighting itself?
Oh, this is a good question. And my feeling is that a lot of them are about the immediate context. I imagine there are probably a couple in there that are looking ahead, or at least there is an implicit sense of either a restoration or a movement beyond a state of affairs. Many of them are also recalling particular episodes in a shared cultural history. So, at least in some of Judith's speeches, she references the patriarchs Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, and these certain conflicts they had, and she uses it in this sense of testing, but then they go on to have some kind of legacy, some name for themselves, some success. So perhaps implicit in some of these, appealing to how things were, our shared kind of cultural history, how things might be if we act in the same way. There's the sense of doing the appropriate thing in the appropriate context. So I think it's difficult to say how they visualize much beyond. I think perhaps the closest, or one of the speeches to think about really closely towards this, would be one of the only non-Jewish speeches in this corpus of Jewish texts will be Josephus' speech that he gives to Titus, kind of on the eve of destroying the temple, essentially, or the immediate context is that he's besieging Jerusalem. And this is a very long kind of classical speech. And I've yet to really dive into this one in my work. I think these kind of questions about what's being visualized as coming after this, I would expect to see more there, where you do get a lengthy, really lengthy speech. A lot of the early ones in biblical material, so the book of Joshua and books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, are very, very short. And essentially they have some, again, this element of not fearing. They maybe call on people to defend a particular situation, or maybe it's even very, very contextual. So one of them in Chronicles is we divide in two forces, and if I'm being pushed back, you come to help me, and if you're being pushed back, I come to help you. And that's kind of like the speech is so contextual for that specific activity, battle, whatever. It's the length of them almost precludes this ongoing vision of what the future can be. But we do have in the same work these ideas of peace. So I'm thinking particularly, I believe, of 1st Maccabees 14, and we have this eulogy of Simon. So in this so-called eulogy, this is after Simon, one of the Hasmonean Maccabean brothers of the first generation, dies. He essentially is buried in this very elaborate way, but there's this almost a hymn or a eulogy that talks about the land having rest all the days of Simon, and all these honors he has, extending the borders, gathering captives, removing uncleanness from the land, planting trees. In verse 9, we have old men sat in the streets and they talked together of good things, and the youths put on splendid military attire. And then supplying towns with food, means of defense. There's this vision of what a nation or a place looks like under peaceful conditions. So I think this would be an interesting counter text almost to read alongside these texts that reflect on very, very negative situations, because they often dwell on the stakes in terms of if we fail, what happens. So they're very, very negative. So they're looking towards a worst case scenario. But perhaps on the other end, we read these texts of when they have success out the other side, and we see what they're really envisioning as, should we succeed? With all that said, I think by their nature, a pre-battle speech imagines a good outcome only through violence.
Yeah.
And we should interrogate that as a construct, as a way to peace, through often very, very excessive violence in these texts. So taking the book of Joshua, for instance, it is complete destruction. And when you really read Joshua 6, it is overwhelmingly violent. And Judith 14 as well, this utter destruction of enemies. And this is how moving forward to that peace is achieved.
Okay, Joe, so thank you. You've given us a really good sense there of the range of texts and genres where we can find pre-battle speeches in ancient literature, particularly ancient Jewish texts. And you've raised the important question of how fictional, even supposedly factual or historical speeches can be in their narrated form. And that is a really important caveat for lots of reasons. But I suppose particularly as we consider what pre-battle speeches do to their wider readership, not just their internal audiences, they are a really, really interesting form of storytelling for us at the Visualising War project, because they very much get to the heart of our research on the world-building nature of narratives, the way in which the stories that we tell not only reflect how war gets pursued, but can actively shape it by shaping how people think and feel and behave. Pre-battle speeches, of course, are explicitly designed to influence what their primary audiences feel and think and do. But as you say, these texts also have much wider audiences. And as you've already outlined, they're shaped by all sorts of narrative traditions as well. So they have a really broad influence potentially on our habits of visualizing and pursuing war, and the ideas that they canonize and the messages that they perpetuate. So with that in mind, I wonder, can you say a little bit more about how exactly these pre-battle speeches that you've been studying tend to pan out in the texts that survive from antiquity?
Sure. Again, this fits into some of my early comments on the context Josephus is writing into. And he himself apparently goes before the walls of Jerusalem and gives a speech to the defenders, and he's telling them to give up, like they have no hope of succeeding against Rome. So I think we could almost think of this as an anti-battle speech. It's don't turn to violence in a context where you would usually expect someone to be advocating for that same violence. So these are kind of some interesting ones that he sows in there. I don't think there's many of the texts that we get these same surrender elements, at least in these texts. They're very often very martial. And then alluding again to Masada, Josephus tells this narrative of holdouts in this mountain fortress until 73. He tells the story where essentially, I think 1,000 people or so decide they have no hope of holding out, and they decide that it is better for them to face death than slavery, I think is the explicit implication. And again, this also recalls some language used in Judith. Judith tries to convince people to violently resist to prevent going into slavery, essentially. And there's a whole lot more that could be said about that and how these cultures and texts also dealt with the idea of slavery. But that aside, in this Masada narrative, they essentially have this, it's potentially conventionally understood in this line of martyrdom literature. So going to one's death willingly because there is a line that you will not cross. So it's something you won't do. So you will give up your own life. It's almost like the other half of battle speeches, because they're both convincing someone to do something very violent, but it's entirely directed at the self instead of the other. So a lot of the same things happen, but in practice it is very, very different. And the kinds of emotions it might inspire of the audience are very, very different. What we also see in these is, I think there's been much more attention to these martyrdom narratives. I think because they have been taken up within a Christian cultural context where martyrdom is a lens by which the crucifixion is perhaps understood. And it's also a narrative that Christian communities tell about themselves. So this persecution, martyrdom kind of, and it really is a narrative that constructs a sense of identity. It's not really necessarily something that is taking place to the degree it's imagined and told to. But they've received a lot of attention, and pre-battle speeches in this corpus haven't.
Yeah.
And there's something interesting going on there, I think.
And it seems so important to pay attention to pre-battle speeches, because as visualizations of war, they are a really good example of narratives that are that are imagined as driving conflict, not just representing it, not just narrating it, not just looking back on it or reflecting on it. So they really are narratives with purpose. Joe, as you mentioned, First and Second Maccabees and Josephus's texts are historical accounts, even if the speeches within them are not historically accurate and have been conjured for the purposes of the historical account. But we do find pre-battle speeches in a range of other genres. For example, in the War Scroll, a manual for military organization found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. Can you tell us about this text?
So the War Scroll is known by many names. It is also called the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, or against the sons of darkness, or milhama, which is Hebrew for war. Essentially, it is about this eschatological war, so a war around the end times, that the sons of light will fight against the sons of darkness, who are called by many other names, so followers of Belial and all these other kind of terminologies, or the Kittim as well, which again is variously identified as other nations or empires. So the document contains a great many ritual instructions for how this war will unfold over the course of 40 years, who will fight in it, lots and lots of details about banners and trumpets and what will be written on them, and the 7 stages of the war. So in alternate stages, the sons of light get the upper hand, and then the sons of darkness get the upper hand. Another caveat, I am just using those titles for the groups, but the terminology for who is fighting whom changes a lot. But they go through these stages, and in the 7th round, ultimately the sons of light win and utterly destroy their enemies, and this is with divine help. The document is quite odd in many ways because it's quite fragmentary. So the bottom several lines of each of the columns. So there's 19 columns in total. So the bottom 3 or 4 lines that are visible are eaten away in places. And then there's perhaps 3 or 4 lines below that as well that are completely missing. So there's a lot about it that we're a little bit uncertain of how it fits together. And we also have some sense that it's put together or pulled together from different sources. So the War Scroll in these columns reincorporates and even quotes directly from Deuteronomy here, and then launches into a hymn almost in columns 10 through 12, and other kind of direct address, seemingly, maybe hymn is the wrong word, maybe prayer, but it seems to be a direct address often to the deity. So it's very peculiar. What I would like to have is a nice, neat little battle speech of 3 lines that I could say, this is what the War Scroll imagines takes place before a battle, or will take place, or maybe instructs the priest to do. But it also has a whole lot of other material that is very strange. But it's very interesting to think about from the perspective of, is this a battle speech? For instance, in column 15, we have the chief priest. He reads a prayer from some book of Ito, or the time periods, I believe is the translation, but this is also not a text known otherwise. And then he gives them some words of encouragement, beginning with be strong and courageous as warriors, telling them not to fear, not to panic, not to be alarmed, so on and so forth. And then talks about immediately their enemies. Every creature of greed shall wither away quickly. And then talks about strengthening themselves. The mighty ones of God are girding themselves for battle, and some other kind of elements like this. And then further down in column 17, we have this reference to Michael. So this angel Michael, perhaps also understood as an archangel, whatever that is. But he also seems to join the fighting and decisively help win. And then there's also this reference to God's crucible. So this idea that the war is testing. Judith has a very, very similar thing. So the idea the conflict tests the people who are faithful, and some are found to fail that test. There's an interesting detail in the War Scroll about some people being discovered when they fall in battle, then they are not part of the proper community of the Children of Light. For whatever reason, they're not truly part of the community. And we get a very, very similar thing in First Maccabees. I believe First Maccabees, where some troops fall in battle and then they are discovered to have on them these kind of idols, or it's a very strange little thing. And there's a lot of discussion about exactly what these were, but maybe idols or something that essentially represents they are not observing the proper worship practices that the author thinks they should. So they have this sense of failure is due to something about that person's practice or beliefs, and only the righteous remnant are kind of kept alive and have success. And then the end of the War Scroll is completely damaged. We have one column, very, very fragmentary column, so-called column 19. And to put some perspective on this, there are between 4 and 6 columns on each of the other sheets. So these are segments of leather that the text is written on. Of the final sheet, we only have this one column. So presumably there's a whole lot of material that is just missing about what happens in the end. So we don't know. There's just these little details that seem to be very peculiar and really working with previous traditions, particularly Deuteronomy, on the role particularly of priests in battle speech or as battle speech givers.
Yeah. So clearly a very challenging text to work with in all sorts of ways, and a text that is both quite idiosyncratic, but also, as you say, drawing on established traditions where we can definitely see continuity of fear not, of the othering of enemies as wicked. And then this idea and the way in which this pre-battle speech also is identity forming, with conflict testing you, and the way in which you might fall in battle or not, helping to sort the sheep from the goats in a way. So really fascinating, if quite challenging text to work with. As you know, Joe, some of my research has focused on ancient Greek and Roman technical writing, including the treatises such as Onisander's Strategikos, Frontinus' Stratagemata, which both offer instructions on how to be a good general. And those texts visualize future in quite idealizing ways, as I think the War Scroll does, projecting success if their readers follow the models contained in their books. And they also feature moments where generals within the text give exemplary pre-battle speeches to their soldiers. So they visualize behaviors and actions in the future which soldiers are meant to perform. And they also show us how, when generals visualize that for them, that also tends to go well. So they make this concrete connection between instructions and the way in which a pre-battle speech might picture the future and how that future then pans out. Does the text of the War Scroll, or do any of the other speeches that you've looked at, imply that readers might end up realizing the visions of fighting which it sets out? Or does the text not make quite such a strong connection between how these instructions, how military experts or advisors plan and visualize, the connection between that and how battle does work out?
I think of all of the ones I've been able to identify, the War Scroll is really the only one that is thinking ahead, and it's very programmatic. So it's just, this is what you shall do. It's instructional in a sense. If you're acting this out, it almost is very strange in some sense as well, that there's clearly a reference with some knowledge of military structure or practice or the use of trumpets or this, that, and the other, but it's predicting an outcome of a 40-year war right down to particular battles and surges and this, that, and the other. So it almost goes beyond what I think you're describing in these other texts that tell you essentially how to properly manage a thing. And this tells you exactly what will happen in this very singular and significant conflict. I have no idea how you would implement something like this, because it is even the ages of people who serve in different parts of the army. So who is the cavalry? Who is this? That they're just divided by age. And I think the commanders are 50 to 60 or something like this. So that there's a lot of typological imagining going on. And it seems to be something that is imagining a divine intervention in the course of history that supersedes almost proper strategic planning. A lot of these texts have the sense that the deity ends wars. So Judith ends on this hymn, God who crushes wars. This is a citation, I think, of Exodus through the Greek as well. So it's slightly different from the Exodus quote you might find in most Bibles. But this idea that God is one who ends wars is very significant. And I think this picks up that again, which is a shift away. In some sense, we can see in the books of the Maccabees, they're reacting to essentially having to conduct a guerrilla campaign. They're having to resist and flee to the hills and do this other kind of stuff. And Judith reflects perhaps on a bit of siege warfare. But in terms of what you should do in these, I think most of the speech givers would say you must depend entirely on the deity. And if you fail, it's because you're not in the in-group. Can't really do much about that. Other than make sure your observance is right, I guess.
Yeah, and observance and ritual practice and so on. And obviously the War Scroll is very interested in the role of priests specifically. So there's a whole spectrum within the texts that you're looking at, from divine intervention to human agency, or maybe the other way around. And the War Scroll clearly is more prophetic than prescriptive, and very much a kind of an extreme version of that pre-battle imagination and that pre-battle visualization, while being part of a broader trend. I'd like to end, if I may. We could talk about these texts again and again, and if we had more time, I'd want to dig dig more into the book of Judith and so on. But I'd like to bring things to a close just by thinking a little bit about the legacy in antiquity and beyond of this very recurring tradition. Given the prevalence of so many pre-battle speeches across different genres, what impact do you think they might have had on readers across antiquity and beyond on wider cultural and cross-cultural habits of visualizing conflict?
It's a very good question, and I feel substantially unequipped to give a comprehensive answer. I think we can take at least some of these texts, particularly Joshua, has had a very profound place in the history of the world, not least through its adoption in Christian tradition and its mapping of the typologies of people. So particularly the Canaanites onto enemies, onto colonized people, onto this, that, and the other. And the way Joshua envisions almost the absolute destruction of this group. Notably, in Joshua 6, Rahab is singled out in Joshua's pre-battle speech as one to be spared. Perhaps there's a way through, but this complete destruction is something that seems to come through. My feeling is that I would not be surprised to see texts that so readily lend themselves towards encouragement to violence to be reused and redeployed in different situations that the users of these texts want to encourage others to violence. I'm sure it's not limited to them, but they seem very readily able to be redeployed. And at some point, I think I'll just start collecting things I notice without systematically searching for them, as I situate myself entirely in the ancient world, and that's where I spend all my days reading. One thing I would pick up on, I think that has been very topical at the moment, is particularly a misunderstanding of certain elements of what Benjamin Netanyahu has included in some of his public speeches around the Israel-Gaza conflict, Israel-Hamas war. And this includes his reference to the children of light and children of darkness. So he's used this as a way to talk about essentially what's at stake, create in-group, out-group, all these other kind of things. And as far as I can tell, he's drawing from the War Scroll quite explicitly. People have identified that this kind of language, I think, also comes from the book of Isaiah, but it readily fits the construction or cosmological construction of the world from the War Scroll. I simply noticed this because I had been reading about the War Scroll for probably a month. Then lots of this started happening. And then at least two people sent me, I think there was a tweet from an official Twitter that included this. And then there was also a speech given, at least on two occasions. I think this language was used, particularly in this conflict. I think the world construction, the ideas of the stakes of conflict and the language that they take are and have been and almost certainly will continue to be drawn from these kind of texts and ideas that lend themselves readily to this. And I think one important thing, especially when we're thinking about biblical texts, because they have a heritage that is incredibly important for many, many people around the world who really value what these texts have to say, there is something in questioning the kinds of constructions of the world that these texts, as exemplified in my project in these speeches, but the way they construct reality around particularly in-group, out-group, and routes to peace. And I think it's partly because I've been really dwelling in texts that advocate for violence that I'm maybe in this mindset. But I think we need to examine a heritage that often frames the route to peace through violence, and often very, very over-the-top violence, and what this does for our perception of what does achieving peace mean? How do we get there? Like I say, I'm rooted each day. I'm reading about these very, very particular situations. So I think I'm thinking about that. But it's just a takeaway, I think, to question these and the frameworks that the speakers are and the texts are talking to an in-world text audience to encourage them about something. And they're also doing a lot in terms of identity construction of us and them. And I think by the same token, those texts are doing the same thing to their readers in antiquity and now.
Yeah.
And we don't have to go along with that.
Yes, as you say, very, very topical. I mean, we've been talking about the war scroll as it might have been written and read 2000 years ago, but it is very sobering to see allusions to it, Netanyahu drawing on it. And as you say, these pre-battle speeches that you are studying, which in some cases are made up, are fictional, or at least seriously massaging history, which play a role within a narrative where they speak to an internal audience, they continue to resonate. They continue to resonate and be leveraged and deployed today. And when those kinds of texts encourage binary ways of thinking about them and us, about righteous people and lawless people, when they do so much identity building, and when they also, map typologies of people within the context of annihilating some and sparing others or defending others, they continue to have power and have force today. And that's really one of the key things that the Visualising War and Peace project is interested in, this constant feedback loop between narrative and reality and the way in which stories are world building. And so you have helped us really wrestle with a very central problem that we have, a very central issue, that narratives that visualize war sometimes end up shaping the way in which people realize war. And as you say, realizing violent routes to peace rather than looking at other opportunities and thinking about pre-peace speeches or visualizing peace in ways that might be a call to action rather than a call to arms. So thank you very much, Joseph, for that really fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm having new thoughts all the time and quite an early project, but just now I'm wondering whether speeches for peace might be a really nice follow-up and a bit more uplifting.
Indeed. Thank you. And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We do have some more episodes coming up over the autumn and winter as we continue exploring experiences of conflict, narrations of conflict and peace building in different periods and places. So please do keep tuning in. If you'd like to support our project, please do share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use. And please do leave us a rating and review if you can, because it helps other people find the show. If you'd like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War, or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you very much for listening.